Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the bucket courses. I'm Joanne Bundy. I chair the Community Education Council, which is so happy to provide the bucket courses for you. If you will take just a moment to check to make sure that your cell phone is silenced. I always see a lot of heads going down when I say that. And the room is wired for T-coil. So if your hearing aids accommodate T-coil, you can turn that on as well. I don't know about you, but the more I learn, the more I find out I don't know. And this is a perfect illustration of it in our course today. Writing, History of a Technology. I confess I have not thought about where writing came from. And I've never thought about it as a technology. But luckily, we have someone here today who has thought a lot about it, and he's going to tell us about it. Gerald LaLonde is Professor Emeritus of Classics at Grinnell College. This is his first time doing the bucket courses, so please behave yourselves. And I am happy to introduce Gerald LaLonde and his topic, Writing, a History of Technology. Welcome, Gerald LaLonde.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Joanne. I'm very happy to be here. Giving a bucket course has been on my bucket list. And you know that all this bucketry has a rather ominous etymology. So I want to begin by wishing all of us many more happy years. I probably also should disclaim any responsibility for any demise that may ensue upon my lecture. Unless the cause is on me. I used to get student evaluations that referred to Mr. LaLonde's infamous monotone. Kinder students wrote that the monotony was punctuated by a lot of digressions and occasional wit. So you'll be the judge of that. But now Joanne is thinking, is he ever going to get serious? Yes, philosophy is serious. So I will start with arguably the two greatest of Greek philosophers, Plato and his pupil Aristotle. Plato makes clear in his dialogues, often explicitly, often implicitly, that in any kind of discourse, debate, argument, it is necessary to have a reasonable and common definition of the key terms. So I should define writing at the beginning. There are some small nuances in the meaning of writing. Literature is writing, but I won't be talking about novels or such. We're going to talk about the technology of writing. But there are also some really big nuances in the meaning of writing, and I would mention one of those. The late Jacques Derrida, French philosopher, father of the theory of deconstructionism. Most historians of writing put the invention of this technology back in the late 4th millennium BC in Sumeria. But Mr. Derrida puts it back at least 35,000 years, maybe 100,000 years, maybe 200,000 years. And how does he achieve that feat of legerdemain? He redefines writing. He defines it as all artistic creation and everything that makes that creation possible. So conceivably, as soon as our species evolved about 200,000 years ago, we were already engaged in writing. But you have to give credit to Derrida that he is faithful to his theory, because the prime tenet of deconstructionism is there is no such thing as stable meaning. Beware of professors who give new definitions to old terms, or new terms for old definitions, and claim novelty. This is precisely the kind of sophistry that Plato was concerned with when he made all of those remarks about defining things, defining their terms. His contemporary Aristophanes wrote a very funny play, comedy The Clouds, in which he features the sophists who try to wiggle their way through life by, as he says in Greek, making the weak argument strong and the strong argument weak. If we could bring in Thucydides, we could push this moral a little further. Thucydides would tell you it can be dangerous when you cut loose words from their semantic moorings. That is, when tyrants start to give good terms for bad things and bad things for good terms. We're all familiar with enough politics and military history to know all about that. Well, Derrida didn't go that far, but I won't be talking about writing in the Derridian extent. So we can go on to Aristotle to define writing. Aristotle gives a very neat formula for defining things. He says you first establish the class of things to which that which you want to define belongs. And then you establish enough differentiating characteristics that will distinguish that thing from all the other things in the class. So we could start, it's a fair thing to say that writing, the class to which writing belongs is communication, but there are all kinds of communication. There's speech, auditory communication. There's tactile communication. But in writing, we use our eyes. So we get the first differentiating characteristic we can say is, visual is a distinctive characteristic of writing. But there are many forms of visual communication. There's sign language for the deaf. There are winks, obscene gestures. These are all visual modes of communication, but we wouldn't classify them as writing. So, writing is conveyed by symbols. This just is another differentiator. But is this writing? This is a poster that was published in Tasmania shortly after the colonization there by the Dutch. And the message is obvious, that the natives and the colonists are to get along, and this has been agreed to by their respective leaders, and that justice will be administered equally among the natives and the colonists. But is this writing? It's a set of visual symbols, but the problem is it would suggest a system where you have unlimited symbols, which is not practicable. You would have to draw a picture for every conceivable idea that you want to convey. So we need another characteristic, and we'll call it systematic or conventional visual symbols. We'd add one more thing, a sort of light differentiate. Let's consider Native American smoke signals. They could be systematic visual symbols, but do we call them writing? No, but they could be writing. So let's put in two-dimensional. Because even if we look at smoke signals, we view them in two dimensions, and most writing is executed and read in two dimensions. That is etched or drawn on a fairly flat, relatively flat surface. And evidence of that is this list of etymologies of words for writing. They all have to do with incising, scratching, tearing, carving, or drawing, painting. This reflects pre-writing and the origins of writing. That is, writing is done on a two-dimensional surface. This is a very common way of describing technology. When an innovation is made, we usually bring the terms of previous forms of that technology and apply them. For example, in vehicles, we use words like sedan, coach, car. These are all words that are borrowed from the days before steam power or the internal combustion engine. Okay. Let's go on. I want to make a distinction between language and writing. Our writing is so invested with language, it's a very phonetic system, the alphabet, that we take the idea of writing as being for granted as being phonetic. But writing and language are two quite different things. I should say this also because some linguists of the behaviorist school consider all communication to come under the term language. But I take it more in the etymological sense. The Latin lingua, which yields our words language, has to do with the tongue. So it's speech or a system of speech is what I would mean by language. And it can be distinguished from writing both by the nature of the two terms and also by the chronology of the two things, writing and language. Language is a function of our evolved nature. It goes way back in human evolution. Whereas writing is a technology, it's a learned thing, and it's fairly late in human history. Speech is nature, and writing is nurture. Herodotus tells many great stories, and one of them is to this point. He talks about the Egyptian pharaoh Psammetichus in the 7th century, who wanted to determine what was the prototype of all languages. So he performed this experiment. He took 2 infants, and he had them put in isolation, where by one version they were nursed by sheep, and another version mute women nursed them. And the pharaoh set a guardian there, and he was to report to the king what was the first utterance of these children. Okay. The first thing the guardian reported that he heard was the word Bacchos. And so Psammetichus sent out his agents to look at all the languages that they knew about. They didn't have dictionaries. It must have been a very tedious operation. And they found out that Bacchos was the Phrygian word for bread. So Psammetichus determined that Phrygian was the prototype of all languages. One of the King Jameses of Scotland replicated this experiment and came to the conclusion that that language was Hebrew. Well, these are obviously silly objectives. The idea that language is monogenetic, that is, it all came from one proto-language, is a silly notion. And even sillier is the kind of strange Lamarckianism that a baby would be born speaking or learn to speak or invent the speech that is this proto-language. But in this experiment, there is one very smart premise. And it's one that last week's speaker, Cynthia Hansen, the linguist, made clear. That humans will, by their nature, learn language or they will invent language. So that is that distinguishes writing from language. Now the chronological bit. I've been reading up on my paleontology. It's very hard to give exact dates in paleontology, but I read a smart article recently that says all of us here are are descended from a group of people who separated themselves from the other hominids back about 200,000 BC. And that we ran around and climbed the trees until about 100,000 BC. And in the 50,000 years after that, our brain and our vocal anatomy evolved in mutual support with one another to produce complex speech and complex thinking. This is an interesting idea, that complex speech and complex thinking go together. The Greeks were aware of this relation of speech and thought, because they used the same word for reason, logos, as they use for speech, logos. So we're not talking about the primatologist who says, my chimp knows 100 words, because he can press a button that he knows will give him a banana out of 100 buttons. Or the dog owner who says, my dog tells me when he wants to go for a walk by wagging his tail and barking. That is not language. Neither the chimp nor the dog could say or answer this riddle. Brothers and sisters, I have none. That man's father is my father's son. What relation is that man to me? That is logos, both speech and thought. So, writing began in the late 3000s BC in Mesopotamia. We'll look at a map of the Fertile Crescent here. This was an amazing revolution in human history, and obviously a relatively late one. The area around rivers, famous old rivers like the Tigris and the Euphrates here, or the Nile, the rich soil that surrounded those were primary habitations for very early people, Paleolithics, and then they have a long stretch of Neolithic. These are 19th century terms that really don't fit anymore, but we know their distinctive characteristics. The Neolithics were people who stopped being hunters and gatherers and became agrarian and pastoral people, lived in relatively small villages and in relative peace because they were busy raising their food and didn't have a lot of time to fight with one another. I don't deny that there is archaeological evidence of conflict in the Neolithic period. But around the end of that millennium, around 3100, there is an explosive technical revolution both in Egypt and Mesopotamia. And this is a synergy of powerful technologies, all of them reinforcing one another. Agriculture on a large scale, building of large cities, large governments, empires and kingdoms, metallurgy, the complex invention of bronze. And it was early historians who thought that that was the catalytic element, and that's why they called this revolutionary period the Bronze Age. But that's an obsolete and antiquated term. We're not sure at all that bronze, the creation of the alloy of bronze, was the spark that set off this revolution. Well, writing was part of this revolution. It was a case of necessity being the mother of invention. That is, in order to administrate and to operate these vast technologies, writing became necessary and it was invented. But it is also a causal factor because it makes possible the further advances of technology. So I should say something. I mean, one of the premises of this course is that it's easy for us to take writing for granted. But you can see from how late it is in our history what an amazing technology it was. It's true that oral traditions had a great history. They could pass on information. We can thank oral tradition for the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Gilgamesh epic, the book of Genesis. These were products of great oral traditions that were eventually written down and have come to us. But oral transmission is always subject to change, embellishment, manipulation, which is not to say that writing can't be manipulated. We all know many examples of that: forgeries, plagiarism, exaggeration. But it's distinguished from oral tradition that it can pass on information in an exact form. And it can pass it on over great distances and over great lengths of time. Oral tradition cannot do that. Therefore, knowledge information can be stored up and multiplied. If we think about the advanced technologies of our own age, things like airliners, skyscrapers, the whole computer technology, none of that would have been possible in an oral culture. Those things are the product of numerous technologies that are piled on top of one another, and writing was the key to the transmission of those technologies. Now, the ancients were amazed by writing, what it could do, but they very quickly lost any knowledge of its history and its origins. And therefore, they attributed writing, its amazement, to as a gift of the gods. The Egyptians thought writing was given to them by their god Thoth, and the Greeks thought it was Hermes. And both of these are messengers of the other gods, and they're also gods of invention and magic. So that made some sense. Medieval Christians believed that writing came from God. It was either given directly to Adam so that he could write down the names of the various things that God gave him in the book of Genesis, or one of the archangels brought writing to Adam, or in some views, Adam invented it. Well, thanks to modern archaeology, we now know quite a bit more about the origins and history of writing. So now I'll go to get more technical and talk about the typology of writing. That is, the different types of writing and the terminology that goes with them. All writing can be divided by that horizontal line between pre-phonetic writing, which has it has a long history, but it's very quickly changes to the second kind of writing, that is phonographic writing, writing that is attached to speech, phonetics. And ideographic writing means things or idea writing. It's also called semasiography, which simply means meaning writing. And it can be in two forms: pictograms, pictography. I think I have an example here. Yes. This is a copy of a census that was taken by the great Ogallala war chief, Red Cloud. He made a census of the important people in his tribe. And this is his own autograph, Red Cloud. This is his top man, Angry Bear, male dog, lower man, etc. You get the, but this is not systematized writing. It's no more systematized than that poster from Tasmania. So conceivably, that is theoretically, we could have a system of writing that was made up entirely of pictograms, but it would be highly impracticable because, again, you would have to draw a picture. It's not only impractical because of the number of symbols you would have to know to learn, but also the difficulty of going to the trouble of drawing each thing. So, pictography is a theoretical but impractical form of writing. All pictographs are ideographs. Here is, we also must pay attention to Plato's necessity of the meaning of terms. But an ideograph can be a symbol that no longer looks like the thing it stands for. So all pictograms are ideograms, but not all ideograms are pictograms. They become abstracted, and this happens very early in the history of writing. Let's see. Here is a table, and it's purely hypothetical, and is now not well believed, that the Sumerian early system of writing started with a purely pictographic system, and then it gradually evolved into a purely literal system that we call cuneiform. I'll talk more about that later. But now it's apparent that there are too many missing links. We have no clear evidence of a purely pictographic form of writing among the Sumerians. The only thing we have that is certain is this final cuneiform, linear form of writing. So even ideography is not going to work perfectly because you need an infinite or unlimited number of ideograms to communicate. Here's an example of a limited system of writing by ideograms, the international traffic symbols. Ignore the captions, which say what they are, but most international drivers would be able to interpret these from one language to a user to another. So here we have an ideographic system, but it's very limited. If we try to expand this to all and any communication, again, we run into the problem of an unlimited and purely theoretical, impractical system. So we go back to the first step in phonetic writing is what is called logography. Logos, you remember, is the word for word or writing, word, as speech, language. A logogram is a symbol that stands for a word in a language. Let's look at an example. This is not an abstract example, but it could be. This could be a logogram in English for the word wheel. In other words, it no longer stands just for the object wheel, it now stands for the word wheel. And the nice thing they discovered about logograms, this first little invention in phonetic writing, was that you could form compounds from these logograms. We put a chair there, another logogram, and we can form the compound wheelchair. I made up these examples. It's more instructive than, say, using some ancient examples, but we'll see some of those later on when I talk about the different cultures and their writing systems. Here's another symbol for wheelchair. This is an international ideogram for handicap accessibility, but it could also be either a logogram or an ideogram for wheelchair. In English, it's a logogram for the word wheelchair. To a German, it would be a logogram for Rollstuhl, rolling stool. But it's also an ideogram. It could be an ideogram for wheelchair for a person who speaks a language which has no word for wheelchair, but knows what a wheelchair is. Okay, you're getting the drift of it. So that's either a logogram or not. Now we go back and look at the really revolutionary invention in the history of writing. And that was the idea that you could break up language into individual pieces of sound and then create new words. There's a theory that this was motivated by rulers back in Sumerian Egypt who wanted to express their personal names in the writing. And this happened very early. If your name is Red Cloud or White Buffalo, it's easy to have a pictogram or an ideogram for your name. But what if your name is the one who is blessed by Ahura Mazda, or your name is Illuminated Wisdom? Then you have a problem. And they very quickly created a solution to this problem, and it's what is called rebus writing. And you're all familiar with that from your childhood puzzle books. Somebody tries to explain the meaning of rebus writing from this Latin expression, non verbis sed rebus, not by words but by things, which is, it's not a very good definition of rebus, so I'll read you an official definition. The written representation of words or syllables by pictograms or ideograms whose names resemble in sound the intended words or syllables. Now that's a lot of abstract terms, but rebus is best understood by examples, so I've made up some examples for this also. Let's take the surname Fordyce. There's no object that we can put on paper, that no pictogram or ideogram that will give us the word Fordyce. So what did the ancients do? They'll do in modern times. We use two ideograms, an ideogram for the number 4 and a pictogram or an pictogram in this case, which is an ideogram for dice. We could do it another way. The same effect. So you can see how neat, very quickly, these early writers tumbled to the fact, if I can do this with proper names, I can do it with any abstract word. So I can finally get out of this early trap of using just pictures or emblems for things. This is a famous statue from Egypt, Ramses II, who lived, he was a pharaoh in the 13th century. And he had a statue made which is a rebus about he himself, about his name. It has 3 images. In the back is the falcon god Horus, who by Ramses' time had merged with the sun god Ra. So that represents the word Ra. And you'll see that in Egyptian, they used only consonants. They did not use vowels. And I'll talk about that later. But you have to supply the vowel, which you will find out is possible to do. Ramses is presented here as a child, and the word for child in the Egyptian is meh, and the hieroglyph that indicated that word was simply, had the sound for M. And likewise, he's holding in his left hand a sedge plant, and the word for that in Egyptian was su. And the ideograph that represented it was represented the consonant S. So here he has a statue that uses the rebus system to celebrate himself and his name. Let's take an abstract word like belief. And we'll use modern pictograms. This is the way you do it. But remember that these pictograms become abstract very early on because it's difficult to draw. It would be very tedious to write a long text using a method like this. So we go back to belief and we institute 2 rather abstracted ideograms. And the person who uses these knows that the one on the left means bee and the one on the right means leaf. But he has probably lost all knowledge that this descended from a picture of a bee and a leaf. Okay. that was one of the major revolutions in the history of writing. You could say that there were three great revolutions in writing. One is the invention of writing itself. The second is the phonetization of writing, that is, using phonetics for writing. And the last is the invention of the alphabet. We'll talk about that. But now you get the drift of the rebus system, so we'll have a little quiz. I'm going to show you three pictograms that will be to be read from the top down to yield an abstract word, and you just shout out the answer. Yes, you all get an A, catastrophe. That was an easy quiz. We could abstract these and you would have a harder time, but enough said about that. Yes, that's the answer. Okay, let's go back to our table. And we need to talk about a couple more terms. That rebus system involves syllables, but I want to say something about syllabic systems of writing, because some of the ancient civilizations had developed purely syllabic systems. That is where they used only the images for the sounds of syllables. There are two kinds of syllabic writing. I referred to the Egyptian system where they use only consonants. This is a consonantal syllabary. That seems difficult to us. This is a hypothetical consonantal syllabary for our own alphabet, where we would use only the consonants, and we would leave out the vowels. We would have to supply the vowels mentally when we read. We're spoiled by the alphabet, where we have both vowels and consonants. So reading in antiquity was a very slow thing. It was, to us, it would be a kind of decipherment, but you can get used to reading things that are rendered just in consonant signs. I'll show you an example of this. Oh, but this is more than you wanted to know. A consonantal syllabary is called by linguists an abjad, and that is because they make up this acronym for the first four letters of the Arabic alphabet, or the consonantal system. And these are consonants, abjad. But I think you can read this. Can you not? Somebody read it. You're all incipient Egyptologists. Okay, but as you can see, writing was a slow process. We are spoiled not only by the alphabet, which has consonants and vowels, but we have uppercase, lowercase letters, word division, punctuation. Those are all aids to rapid modern reading, relatively modern reading. But back in the days of Sumeria and Egypt, they had the Evelyn Wood School of Slow Reading. And the reason this can work is that I won't say all languages because I don't know all languages, but in most languages, at least most languages, the consonants dominate in number in the language. The consonant sounds there are many more of them than there are basic vowel signs, though admittedly we use vowels for many different sounds. But I'll show you an example. Let's look at the same sentence with the consonants removed. In a fight, it is, I can't even read this and I made up the sentence. So that's a consonantal syllabary, which was common in ancient Egypt and also in all Semitic systems of writing, which I'll talk about later. Now there's one more step. Oh, no, I haven't talked about consonant vowel syllabaries. This is one made up from our own alphabet. In that system, the vowels are also independent symbols. So you have 110 symbols that you can use vowels alone, or you can use any combination of an initial consonant and a vowel. So we have A, E, O, A, U, A, E, O, A, U, K, K, etc. This is a system that we will see in the writing of the Minoans on Crete in the Bronze Age, and also the Mycenaean Greeks on the mainland. And it's also common in the writing of Japanese, which has 2 syllabaries that are of this type. Whether I will get to East Asia, I'm beginning to wonder. How are we doing for time? Is it time for the break? Okay. This is a good place to stop.
Thank you for taking your seats again. Now we're ready for the second half of the class on writing, the history of the technology with Gerald LaLonde. Jerry.
Okay, you can hear me now?
Where does hieroglyphics fit into this?
Yes, when I talk about the writing of the ancient Egyptians, I will talk about hieroglyphics. It's a Greek word that was based on an Egyptian expression for their symbols, which they called holy words. And hieroglyph in Greek means sacred carving. So it's really just a rough translation of what the Egyptians, but it's become a more general word for other symbols. People use it as if it's a broader noun than talking just about Egyptian symbols.
Jerry, would you put the microphone just a little closer?
Hey, is that better?
Yeah, that's
Okay. During the break, my colleague, Professor McIntyre, the music department, I was glad that I hedged my bets about most languages being dominant in consonants. He reminded me of something I already knew, because Dory and I once went to French Polynesia. But there you have languages that are very rich in vowels. What were some of the islands that we went to, like re, And then he reminded me also that in a language like Polish, often you don't find many vowels. I remember I had a friend in graduate school who knew Polish very well. And he used to tell me this riddle about crickets, and it just sounded like Anyway, thank you. Sir.
Speaking of Professor McIntyre, what I thought you were going to say is he told you that music is a language. It's written and it's symbolic and it means something.
That's a good point. The point was, Professor McIntyre is saying, don't credit me with it.
Don't even open that can right now.
Yeah, the gentleman's observation was that musical notation is a method of writing, and I think it would satisfy my definition, or the definition that we came up with. So that's a good point. It certainly is a systematized set of visual symbols rendered in 2 dimensions for communication. Okay, now I'm going to treat briefly another problem that comes up in the history of writing. Another thesis that is not really well espoused now, and that is the monogenesis of writing. I talked about the silliness of Semiticus's experiment where he thought language was monogenetic, There was a period some generations ago when historians of writing thought that writing was monogenetic. That the Sumerians invented writing. You won't be able to see this slide very well. Oh, I didn't talk enough about, I'm sorry. We stopped at the time for break. I should have talked about the last major phase in the development of writing, and I think it is the last. I think I will say that alphabet is the most efficient form of writing, but I'll prove that. No, I won't prove it. I'll argue it later on. And what is it about the alphabet that makes it very efficient? It has a grapheme, which is a fancy word for the symbol, for every phoneme, which is a word that means the minimum unit of sound. Why this is so efficient is that it allows you to minimize the number of symbols in a writing system. We have, 26 letters in our alphabet. So this had a great democratizing influence in literacy, for one thing. So I give you a simple example, the word bat. It has 3 graphemes, B, A, and T, and it has 3 phonemes. The voiced labial consonant, B, the vowel sound, A, and an unvoiced dental, that. Of course, all writing systems are compromises. I mean, one reason we can get to as few as 26 symbols in our alphabet is that we make a lot of the symbols serve double duty or multiple duty, especially the vowels. You can think of so many words where the vowel A, or the sign A stands for ah, etc. So, we now see that there is a kind of logical and technological progression in writing from pictography all the way down to the alphabet, but it cannot proceed regularly and without impediments along the way. Especially when you run into the case of the Chinese wanting to put their language into writing. Their languages, I should say, they're called dialects, but most of the members of the Chinese family of languages are true languages. That is, they are not mutually intelligible. That's the definition of a language, whereas a dialect is a mutually intelligible cognate speech under a family of languages. Well, when you try to have a writing system that covers numerous languages, you have a very difficult time with phoneticizing it. And this is why Chinese is so difficult. They say a minimally educated, well-educated Chinese must memorize at least 4,000 symbols to handle the reading of Chinese. But more about that if I can get to it. Now about monogenesis. This is a table. You don't have to read it. I'll just briefly explain it, by one of the great historians of writing, Gerald. And he theorized that all writing started with the Sumerians in the late 4th millennium. And he has dotted lines where he's being hypothetical in the descent of this writing system. If he goes over to the right, he has Proto-Elamite, which is not deciphered. It was spoken in the early 2nd millennium BC, the 3rd millennium BC, in what is today Iran. And there it passed to a Proto-Indic system of writing, also not deciphered yet, and eventually got to China, where writing appears in the 14th century, the first organized writing, 14th century BC. But that's purely hypothetical. We have no archaeological or linguistic or graphic evidence of that succession. Also at the top, the Egyptians created a writing system very quickly after that of the Sumerians, within a century or so. But there's nothing in the Egyptian system that suggests they borrowed the method of writing from the Sumerians. So when we talk about monogenesis of writing, we have to distinguish between systems that are actually borrowed whole, systems that are actually borrowed in part, and systems that are invented but have simply got the idea of writing from somebody else. And there are instances of all of this. Here's a map of Asia. All of you know geography. I was glad to see they put up a world map in the local coffee shop. Maybe it'll solve the problem. I've heard that 30% of young Americans can't find the United States on a... No, that must be an urban myth. Anyway, here we have Lower Mesopotamia. Uruk was the great city where they found most of these Sumerian tablets. And we have Proto-Elamite around here. And then the Indus River, it's mostly in Pakistan today. The upper tributaries are in India. And writing might have passed to Asia. Here's another piece of evidence that writing is not monogenetic. This is a Mayan book written in pre-Columbian centuries. It's called the Dresden Codex, because it's ended up in a German museum. But it's a fairly long document, but it's a fairly primitive system of writing. It's a system that was shared by the Mayans in Central America and also the Aztecs in Mexico. It consists primarily of pictograms that are somewhat stylized or abstracted, and very little few phonetic signs, which, as in the early writings of the Orient, were used to convey proper names. But the subject matter is decipherable, and it's largely astronomical observations and calendrical observations. And this is characteristic of all early societies, because the logical way to divide the year is by the 12 moons. But of course, that runs you up about 11 point some days short of the solar year. So, and the purpose of calendars, the early ones are holy because you want to please the gods. And you can't be sacrificing to the god of planting at harvest time, which will happen if you keep using the lunar calendar. So they need to have other astronomical observations of stars, or for example, the rising of the sun on the horizon at its northernmost point tells you that that is the summer solstice. And so you can correct then the lunar calendar by interpolation. And that's what this document largely does. It has astronomical, calendrical, and religious, ritual, festival information. But the point is, it was obviously invented completely independently of those early writings in the Orient. Unless you're one of those paranormal people who believes that North America was settled by ancient Carthaginians or perhaps extraterrestrials. Our colleague John Whittaker is one of the great mythbusters of this area. But you can go on the internet and find that there are a lot of people who would rather believe what's interesting than what's true. But to show that the idea, there is not monogenesis, but there is still the fact that writing is largely transmitted from one population to another, from one society to another. And we can show this. it's hard to distinguish those that are in bold type. But all of these in bold type are writing systems that survive to the present day. And they leave aside the East Asian systems of the Japanese, the Koreans, the Chinese, but they constitute most of the writing on in present day Earth. And all of them go back directly to Proto-Semitic, which was a writing system of the 1800s BC. So even though there is not monogenesis, there is this tendency for writing to be borrowed rather than to be independently invented, but it can be independently invented. And so there are four kinds of genesis. There's direct adoption of a system. Our alphabet, the Roman alphabet, it's a very close adoption of the Greek alphabet. I'll talk about that later. There are the adoption of the idea of writing in parts of a system. Then there's the adoption of the idea and the creation of a novel system. And then the absolutely independent invention of writing as by the Aztecs and the Mayans. How is writing propagated? There are numerous historical examples of this. One is, of course, the migrations of people from one area to another. Close to that is colonization. The Greek alphabet spread all around the Mediterranean because the Greeks were great colonizers. Greece does not support many people. Another is conquest, where a conquering people impose their writing system on their subjects. And of course, commercial trade is another way that writing was transmitted. That was how the Greeks created an alphabet out of the Phoenician system of writing, the Semitic syllabary. Now I'm going to go to talk about the actual evidence of writing in societies. And I'll first talk about pre-writing, the kinds of things that are precursors of writing. Some of them are very far removed in time or in space from writing as we've defined it, but they are the placing of images on two-dimensional surfaces, which is a key element in the eventual invention of writing. This is one of a number of cave paintings that come from Indonesia and date as early as 3,500, maybe 40,000 BC. It's really a wonderful expression. We know they did not have aerosol cans in those days. So we know that this artist filled his or her mouth with pigment and liquid and then put his or her left hand on a wall and sprayed it. And there are a number of examples of this. It's a wonderful kind of philosophical self-reflection. That 40,000 years ago, somebody was saying, here I am. This is my signature. This is me. It's very personal. I mean, you've all seen a lot of graffiti, but I don't think that any of them are quite as creative as this. We can call it a graffito, but it's really sanctified in a way by its age. Then we can leap forward, still in the Paleolithic period. This is a painting from the famous caves in France at Lascaux. And it's a beautiful depiction of animals. Animals were, of course, extremely important to these people because they had not yet domesticated them. So they were a main source of food, of clothing, of horn and bone for tools of various sorts. Well, lighting doesn't do justice to that, but if you saw this in a modern art museum, you would think it was a wonderful thing. Here's an actual hunting scene from the same caves in France with bow and arrow. And glyphs, that is not only painted or drawn images, but also those that are etched or carved onto rock surfaces. This is a hunting scene from Kazakhstan, also from the pre-Neolithic times. Here is a glyph from, that is an isolated symbol from Mexico. And this, in a way, gets a little closer to writing in that it probably represents an object or a thing, as opposed to those hunting scenes. Often the circle with a dot in the middle is a very early sign for the sun. And this may be such a sign. It even has rays. Maybe if you think about it more mundanely, it's a flower. Also, owner's marks are predecessors to writing. Before you could write your name, you're not literate. We find these early in the Neolithic period where somebody will scratch a symbol on a pot that says this belongs to the guy who X's his pot. And this is from Sweden. It's a wooden box. It's quite late, but it's thought that this is an owner's mark. Finally, we have mason's marks very early. The Minoans on Crete began to build palaces as early as 2200 BC, and they got successively knocked down by earthquakes and then built again. And by this time, they were building palaces. I think this dates from probably the Second Palace period. They may have had writing by this time, but this is not a sign from the Minoan writing system that we know of. So they began to put palaces together like tinker toys. And this star emblem would say, perhaps this block goes next to another one that has the same mark. Oops. Now we'll go back to Mesopotamia, where the first writing shows up, and I will show you a relatively new theory, or talk about a relatively new theory about the pre-writing of the Sumerian system. And this is a system of tokens that are found from the very beginning of that Neolithic period in Mesopotamia, 10,000 BC, and they are used right down to the invention of writing. And you can see some of them look like they represent actual things. These two are jars of the type that were used to store and ship oil or wine. This is probably a bird of some sort. We know that this symbol, it's so common, is a symbol for sheep, a round sign with a cross on it. But some of these are already fairly abstract, and so we can do away with that neat theory that I showed you, where it went from a pure pictographic system to a pure linear system. Probably even in the pre-writing stages, if this hypothesis is right, the representations of things were already becoming abstract, even in 3 dimensions. This theory is the brainchild of this woman, Denise Mont-Bessara. She's a French-American archaeologist, and she is the one who conceived this whole plan about pre-writing it in the form of tokens. And it's become a widely accepted theory. There are some people who disagree with it, but she is retired, but still very active, so she's a role model of mine. Among the studies that she did of these tokens were included these envelopes. They're called bulla, the clay envelopes. Bulla is the Latin word for bubble. And they were used to ensure the integrity of a shipment of goods. And you would take the tokens that represented these goods and put them inside of this clay ball and seal it up. So if the ball arrives unbroken and you open it up and the symbols correspond to the products, then you know that it's been correctly, it hasn't been robbed in the passage. And then it was a quick jump to the idea of giving an indication on the outside of the envelope of what was in the shipment. And you can take the tokens and press them into the soft clay before it's hardened. And this also gets close to writing in that you're putting the symbols onto a roughly two-dimensional surface. In the same period, Neolithic times, we also find tablets which have similar signs. Not so systematized that we would call them writing, but close to it. Here is a good example. It's a tablet that indicates these liquid products by the two jars. And they have different symbols on them. Perhaps one was jars of wine and one was jars of oil. It also has a decimal numbering system that we're familiar with from Sumeria. The round impression is a 10, and the others are units. So we have 14 jars of one product and 14 of another. So here is a diagram of Denis Montbesserat's theory. The tokens led to two-dimensional symbols that were probably already becoming abstract and didn't look exactly like the thing that they were meant to convey. Where am I? So this is that hypothetical system that we have to qualify greatly. This is a demonstration of the physical method of cuneiform writing. We need to distinguish between the physical process and another meaning of cuneiform. Cuneiform means wedge-shaped, and the writing is wedge-shaped by having a stylus, a reed that has a chiseled end, a very sharp beveled end, and you just press linear lines. Linear lines? Are there other kinds? Into the soft clay. And you can end up with something like this. This is a nice example of a cuneiform tablet, and all of the marks on it, including the divisions, except for the hole at the top, was probably used to attach it to something, are made with that little stylus with the chiseled end. So cuneiform is a word for a physical method of writing, but it is also it's also the word for systems of writing that employ that physical method of writing. And this is a very big history. The first Sumerian writing here very quickly adopts cuneiform writing methods, and that's around 3100 BC. But cuneiform script is used, the physical method, clear down to a document in AD 75. It is dated from its archaeological context. So over 3,000 years, this physical method was used. And as it propagated from Sumeria, it was adopted by at least 15 different languages. And of course, in the process, symbols got changed. You had to add some that worked for your language, and you threw away others. And symbols in various cuneiform scripts vary from 2,000 signs to 400 signs. And it's a fact that in order to decipher a writing system in a language, you need to know both the language and the writing system. And this shows you how the degree to which cuneiform writing evolved. It started here about 3100 BC. It's found in the highlands of Turkey. There was a great empire of the people called Hittites. who flourished there from around 2000 to 1100 BC. They had a great capital at Hattusha in the highlands of central Turkey. So that cuneiform is clear back in second millennium BC, and a little more. Ancient Persian, which is the language that was spoken in what is Iran today, and Farsi, the modern Iranian language, is a descendant of ancient Persian. It, like Hittite, is a Indo-European language, so it's related to Hittite. It's in the same big family of languages. But those languages are so different that when ancient Persian was deciphered in the middle of the 19th century by Henry Rawlinson, he went up to Behistun, where there's a whole cliff covered with inscriptions that were commissioned by Darius the Great, the 6th century king of Persia. And he glorifies Ahura Mazda, he glorifies himself. And then, you might not want to read the rest of the text, he tells in the most grisly detail what he did to all of his unfaithful governors. It's not nice. Anyway, there were enough proper names in the Behistun inscriptions that from works like Herodotus, Rawlinson and others were able to identify the sounds of those names in Greek writing with the sounds of ancient Persian. And so that cuneiform system was deciphered in the mid-19th century. It was not until 1915 that the cuneiform of Hittite was deciphered. And I'll have an interesting story to tell about that in a while. It involves this fellow, who some of you may know. Michelle, you should tell Christopher to get more pixels in his webpage. How much time do we have left?
8 minutes.
Okay, I think I can tell her. No, I think I'll save it till next time. Let's go back to Asia, and I've already talked about the hypothetical passage of writing from Sumeria to China. And I said that the Chinese system of writing is very difficult because from early on it tried to bridge numerous languages. There are early symbols long before the first writing system in China. This is from a Neolithic site called Bampo. This is not a writing system. These are just randomly placed up there by an archaeologist. They're independent symbols that occur on pottery very early in Chinese history. The earliest Chinese writing consists mainly of divination inscriptions. They're sometimes called oracle bones. This one is actually on a bone. Most of these date from the Shang dynasty, 13th century and somewhat after. They are either on bones or on turtle shells. And this operated somewhat like the Delphic oracle. That is, you took the inscription to the priests with a question of, what should I do about this marriage, or should I go on this journey? And then they had this odd system where they would heat up the tablet, the tortoise shell, or the bone until it cracked. And then the priests would interpret the cracks as the answer to the question. Faith is a wonderful thing. The Delphic or the Greeks were very smart, but they sent the Delphic oracle even when they were quite rational in the 5th century. When the Athenians decided they need to name certain voting districts, they put all the names of their heroes in a pot and sent it to Delphi and had the oracle pick them out. Or they consulted the oracle about other important matters. They probably didn't believe in it, but they were like Saint Anselm or Pascal. You know Pascal's wager? He says, if there isn't a God, I better act as if there is anyway, just in case. That was in the mind of most Greeks, and it may have been in the mind of some Chinese when they consulted their oracles. Now, you run into an immediate problem I'll talk about Chinese writing mainly in the modern time, because that is an easy way of demonstrating some of its difficulties. You probably know that Chinese language has 4 tones, and they're illustrated here by the vowel it's about One is a high level, then there's the rising, and then there's the kind of circumflex, and falling, Here's a good illustration of that. We have pinyin is the word for the transliteration of Chinese. So this will illustrate. The difficulty is that the Chinese character does not have any indication of the tone. So you have to learn the tone. And this is not easy because we take a one-syllable word, ma, which should be cognate, but it's in 4 different tones. And the characters don't indicate what those tones are. So you may be calling your mother a horse if you use the wrong tone. Or you may suggest that she's grouchy if you use the word for scold. And hemp, maybe she smokes cannabis. Because the transfer of meaning is very easy in these languages. A good example of that, we could go back to the Sumerian system. They should never have got rid of blackboards. This is a common ideograph for sun among the Sumerians and many Semitic peoples. But by extension, and you can tell this from the context, it alludes to other things that are related to sun. In a context, it can become the word for warmth, the word for light, the word for day. So this is a way in a purely pictographic system that you can expand the capabilities of the writing system. Now, here are some examples. You may be familiar with a common greeting. Ni hao ma. Ma, I think, is ma an interrogative mark? I think it is. That goes a high tone. How are you? And then the falling tone in the word for thank you. Qiu. But you have to learn those by heart. The writing does not convey them usually. You'll see some subtle ways that phonetization can be conveyed with a character. How much time are we doing? It's over. Good. We'll continue this.
Thank you very much, Gerald LaLonde, who is Professor Emeritus of Classics at Grinnell College. Did everybody learn something this morning that you didn't know before? I think so. Well, remember to turn on your cell phones again and turn off your T-coil, and we'll be happy to see you all back here again next Wednesday morning. Thank you for coming.